Hello, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Chris Holshoff. I am a doctoral student with the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States, and today I would like to speak about how we, as educators, can better prepare our undergraduate and early graduate students for historical research in the archives. Contemporary historians are blessed with the opportunity to work with the most extensive sets of data available at any point in human history. But the challenge of reducing an enormous number of documents into comprehensible historical narratives requires more agile research methods than in generations past. And stepping into that seemingly infinite abyss of a modern archive can be incredibly intimidating for junior scholars and students who have worked primarily with secondary resources and a finite range of primary sources. So as educators, it behooves us to prepare our students for that often overwhelming experience of first stepping into the archives. Now, synthesized primary source amalgams offer the pedagogical tools needed to better prepare our students to step into the archives and their ever-increasing number of available documents. And by using such resources in the classroom, historians can train the next generation of researchers to prepare to work efficiently from the moment they enter the field, effectively flattening the learning curve and increasing overall productivity. The official history of U.S. foreign policy, published by the U.S. State Department as the Foreign Relations of the United States, or F.R.U.S, as I like to call it, is perhaps the most valuable of such primary source amalgams available to us as historians and as educators. Now, readily available online at a click of a button, F.R.U.S offers a view of the almost daily unfolding of the political transactions between U.S. diplomats, officials, military officers, intelligence agents, and their international counterparts. And there is no synthesized historical narrative. Instead, F.R.U.S is curated as a series of primary source documents, primarily communications between individuals, offices, and agencies. Essentially, the documents which historians would be reading in government archives. And additional notes and citations to the exact locations of each document provide a deeper sense of the structure of the archives and what is required to pull together such documentation. Now, F.R.U.S is the oldest and the most extensive publication on foreign relations of any state on the planet. The U.S. State Department has been publishing F.R.U.S as the official documentary history of American foreign policy decisions and diplomatic activity continuously since 1861. And these volumes, essentially, are primary source amalgams consisting of government documents, diplomatic cables, State Department communications, so forth, which provide a near day-to-day insight into the inner workings of the State Department, or now the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. And the process of compiling F.R.U.S volumes was professionalized in the 1920s when U.S. Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg hired a staff of professional historians and promulgated rigid regulations and procedures for curating and editing documents. So for the last 100 years, we have had an excellent primary source amalgam now available at a click of a button online. And while traditional printed versions of these primary source amalgams remain available, everything is also available online for the general public. All one has to do is go to history.state.gov/historical documents, or just Google foreign relations of the United States, if that's easier. And you are taken to a page like this, which breaks down F.R.U.S volumes into presidential administrations. Within those series, you see volumes broken down chronologically. And prior to the 1920s, there was no regional classification beyond that. However, after the Kellogg reforms, you see series more like you see here for the Truman administration. So for 1945, for an example, there's a volume for the American republics, 2 for Europe. And since the publications on the Eisenhower administration, series tend to be in about 2 to 4 year segments instead of annually, which allows for deeper regional classification. So for an example, the 1958 to 60 Eisenhower series has a volume solely for Vietnam, another solely for Cuba, and actually 2 full volumes just for the Berlin crisis. And multiple volumes for a region aren't necessarily uncommon. The LBJ administration, for example, actually has 7 full volumes of F.R.U.S published on Vietnam alone. And as one can imagine, crisis points require far more intensive diplomacy, and thus resulting in more documentation of communications and more volumes of F.R.U.S, which need to be curated. And for the past 70 years or so, F.R.U.S has been far more than merely the documentary history of the U.S. State Department. See, in the late 1940s, a newly Republican-controlled Congress was looking for proof of wartime bungling by Democrats and began to pressure the State Department's historical division, which is now known as the Office of the Historian, to produce more detailed volumes of F.R.U.S. And in response, historians curating these volumes began to incorporate documents from offices outside of the State Department. And as a result, F.R.U.S evolved from being an official documentary history of the State Department into the official documentary history of the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. And under the auspices of a nonpartisan advisory group comprised of members of some of America's most respected academic organizations, the Office of the Historian was doing an admirable job of producing F.R.U.S volumes until the project nearly became unraveled in the 1980s. In November of 1978, the State Department established the Classification Declassification Center, or the CDC, and the new department acted as an intermediary between the Office of the Historian and other U.S. government offices during the declassification process. And essentially, the CDC could unilaterally deny declassification requests made by the historians compiling the F.R.U.S volumes. And this was extremely problematic because the CDC was staffed nearly entirely with retired Foreign Service officers, many of whom were Cold Warriors personally implicated in the documents that the Office of the Historian wished to access, and thus exaggerated the sensitivity of material submitted for declassification. And the situation was only made worse in April 1982 when U.S. President Ronald Reagan issued Executive Order 12356, which essentially prohibited any sort of accurate compilation of the historical record by the Office of the Historian. These changes resulted in the publication of several incomplete and distorted versions of F.R.U.S in the 1980s. For an example, the American Republic's 1952-54 volume had no mention of Operation PB Success, the CIA fomented coup that overthrew Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. And this led the editor of the volume to note in the preface that, quote, "The historian who collected and prepared the volume knew that the compilation on Guatemala as published was incomplete and flawed." Even more egregious was the Iran 1952-54 volume, which omitted all references to covert operations, despite CIA Operations Director Kermit Roosevelt having already published a book nearly a decade earlier detailing his role in Operation Ajax, which helped the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. So historians, journalists, and even U.S. senators rightfully began criticizing F.R.U.S as fraudulent. And finally, the Historical Advisory Committee Chairman, Warren I. Cohen, resigned in protest and began making scathing public appearances and op-eds, including the op-ed for the New York Times, which you see on the screen here. The ensuing public outcry resulted in Congress passing the Foreign Relations Authorization Act in October 1991, effectively overhauling the entire declassification process and implementing a legal requirement for the Office of the Historian to publish a, quote, "thorough, accurate, and reliable record of all major foreign policy decisions and significant diplomatic activity." And the language also required F.R.U.S volumes to, quote, include all records needed to provide a comprehensive documentation, which shall omit no facts which are of major importance. Additionally, the Historical Advisory Committee was given declassification authorization and the oversight of the declassification process, which had previously stalled within the CDC. Thus, the Office of the Historian gained declassification authorization for offices across the U.S. government, such as the CIA, the NSA, Department of Defense, the Executive Branch, the State Department, you name it, and began to compile these, quote, thorough, accurate, and reliable records which omit no facts which were of major importance without any classification barriers. They even went back and made new issues for those compromised volumes on Iran and the American Republics in 1952 and 54. And the process of gaining this classification authorization was a game changer. That ability to access classified materials prior to plucking documents for declassification requests has allowed the Office of the Historian to fulfill that now legal mandate to curate full and accurate official documentary histories of the near day-to-day workings of the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. And in addition to the extremely useful documentation in F.R.U.S volumes, that ability to access classified materials prior to making declassification requests effectively bypasses the traditional dilemma faced by historians who must make declassification requests as their first step, not their last, and often without actually knowing what documents exist. It's a catch-22 which historians working on more recent government archives are constantly battling. But these F.R.U.S volumes, which again legally per federal statute must include all records needed for comprehensive documentation of all major and significant U.S. diplomatic activity and foreign policy decisions, provide a means to at least partially bypass that catch-22. Because F.R.U.S volumes don't merely provide the text of these documents, they provide the exact location of those documents in the archives and the offices of the federal government. And thus, by mining the footnotes and bibliography of F.R.U.S volumes, historians can gain incredible insight into what collections of classified documents are out there waiting for a Freedom of Information Act request to be made. Insight that otherwise historians would have never had access to. Thus, as a pedagogical tool, we can use F.R.U.S in a number of remarkable ways in the classroom. First, such a primary source amalgam is going to inherently give our students experience with the kinds of documents they will be working with in the field. Seeing and working with these documents will help them conceptualize and expect what they will find in the field. In and of itself, it's just a good experience. Second, we can use these volumes as a tool to teach students how to critically analyze primary source documents to supplement and refine knowledge gained from synthetic secondary sources. And with due care exercising of awareness of what such volumes of F.R.U.S may be missing and filling in the gaps with supplementary materials, or by reading against the grain for what may be missing from the historical record but is available in these documents, students can refine their historical eye prior to embarking on their own research in the field and thus arriving in the archive far more prepared for success. Third, the citations used in F.R.U.S can be mined by students to garner insight into the breadth of archival material needed to create a historical narrative. Each and every document is accompanied with a citation of exactly where that document is located in the U.S. archives. So by exercising awareness of these citations, educators can help their students map out a research schedule more precisely and efficiently, pinpointing exact collections and boxes of documents they need to access, as opposed to showing up to a given archive, not really knowing where to start. And this won't just allow students to work more efficiently and confidently once they enter the field, but it will also allow them to create grant proposals, which are far more insightful, contain far more precise research schedules, and are much more likely to result in funding of the student's research. Fourth, those same citations give researchers insight to what documents may be available behind classification walls. This will allow for more precise pinpointed declassification requests to access entire collections of classified material, as opposed to fishing in the dark and having to request declassification of documents that traditionally historians don't even know are available. And by beginning this process early in the student's career, they may be able to clear the declassification process prior to writing their dissertations, allowing their work to be the first to encompass given materials. And last but not least, F.R.U.S can be used to familiarize students with the actors and offices in non-US countries they will need to research prior to these students garnering the linguistic skills necessary to do so. Not only does F.R.U.S have detailed information on interactions between US and foreign actors, but each volume has a glossary of all individuals mentioned in the entirety of the volume, which includes both their name and their office, role, or titles. And this is an incredibly insightful tool that allows students to begin to plot out non-US actors and their roles in international events prior to entering non-English archives. And by doing this work early in their studies, while they are gaining linguistic skills, these students will be able to meticulously plan out their archival work. Thus, instead of landing in an archive in a foreign country using a foreign language without a great deal of where to start, an incredibly overwhelming experience for some, of course, they will know exactly what they are looking for and be able to work that much more efficiently. So in conclusion, the primary sources in F.R.U.S, curated by professional historians to highlight the most significant diplomatic documents, are readily accessible to undergraduate and early graduate history students. F.R.U.S provides a palpable sense of what was happening within the U.S. foreign policy establishment on nearly a daily basis, supplementing the less evocative synthetic materials traditionally used in the classroom and providing students with a deeper understanding of the intricacies of historical events. Educators will, of course, still need to provide traditional materials to supplement F.R.U.S with historical context, and help guide students through acquiring the skill of reading the documents against the grain. However, the process of learning to interrogate these compilations of government documents will serve as a superb tool to train students in navigating primary source material long before they delve into archives to conduct their own research, helping them avoid the often overwhelming experience that many junior academics have during their first trips to the field. Synthesized primary source amalgams, such as the Foreign Relations of the United States, offer the means to keep up with an ever-increasing number of available documents. And by using such resources in the classroom, historians can train the next generation of researchers to prepare to work efficiently from the moment they enter the field, effectively flattening the learning curve and increasing overall productivity. Again, thank you for tuning in, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.